Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy so that wherever your trick-or-treating may take you, you have the answers to anyone who wants to buttonhole you on real public policy rather than just some of the rhetoric you get tossed around in the mainstream media. Our first guest this week, a quick point, by the way, if you're looking for archived episodes of this program, we have a YouTube channel. Search Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Our first guest is the chair of monetary policy at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Scott Sumner just wrote a great op-ed The Hill published about the Federal Reserve. Scott, welcome to the program. How are you doing this week?
Very good. Thanks for inviting me.
No, not at all. The title of your piece is "The Fed is Beginning to Learn an Important Lesson." So, my first question is: after 100 years, I guess what was the lesson that they're just starting to learn, and why did it take 100 years for them to learn it?
Okay, the lesson is that they need to pay more attention to market signals of how the economy is doing as kind of a guide to policy. In the past, they've been relying too much on sort of computer models of the economy developed by academic economists, and these models often are not really very reliable in a fast-moving economy. So I've been arguing they should rely more on market signals of where the economy is going and what sort of policy is needed at the current time.
Is there a balance, in your view, of too much versus too little monetary policy? I have plenty of folks who will routinely argue that we don't need the Fed is irrelevant, the Fed should never have existed, et cetera, down the line. But I have a feeling the answer is somewhere closer to the middle. Where is the happy sweet spot of the Federal Reserve in your view?
Okay, I think it's inevitable there'll be a monetary policy of some sort, because as long as you have money, someone has to determine the quantity of it, and certain parameters like that. So even if the Fed didn't exist, someone else would be engaging in policy. Mm-hmm. You could imagine Facebook with Libra or something like that.
No,
but there's also the question of the Fed doing too much versus too little, and that's of course a real concern, and they have to sort of strike a balance. Personally, I favor approach based more on clear rules where there's clear objectives of what they're trying to do, how they're trying to achieve those objectives, and rather than sort of a discretionary shoot-from-the-hip approach where it's not clear exactly what they're doing.
Now, your piece begins by chronicling what we in the media, or at least my programs, have pointed out was almost an effort by the commentariat that I felt to bring on a monetary squeeze, at very least, if not a full-on recession, by reporting on the inevitability of a recession. But your column takes a different tack, asking the very obvious question, well, if there was such an inevitable recession, why hasn't it happened yet? And I guess this is what leads you to, be concerned about the Fed's reactionary, use of some of these data modeling products?
Right. So I pointed out that previously we had never gone more than 10 years without a downturn, and now we're in the 11th year of an expansion. Mm-hmm. And I argue that this is actually the kind of year that in the past we often would have had a recession. And one reason we didn't have a recession this year is the Fed kind of walked away from its models and decided to cut interest rates this year several times, and maybe again this week. And the models actually would not have called for a cut in interest rates because currently the economy seems fairly healthy. Unemployment is low and so on. Stock market's high, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But there's also a lot of sort of red flags in the financial markets that indicate a slowing ahead. And so the Fed was looking at these market indicators and decided it probably needed to cut interest rates because of a lot of things going on all over the world, trade wars, slowing growth in Europe, China, et cetera. And it was reacting, I think, more to market signals. If it had followed its past procedure of just reacting to these models, it would have looked at the low unemployment rate and said, well, we're expecting an overheating economy, so we should be raising interest rates, if anything, not cutting them.
Well, I had heard. For many years that anything under 5% unemployment was overheating the economy, but perhaps in our new, more technological, more gig-based, more freelance economy, perhaps that's a different model. And I guess go ahead.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the model that you're talking about is called the Phillips curve model, which predicts low unemployment will cause high inflation. But I think changes that make it easier to find jobs, more flexibility, unemployed people can become Uber drivers, as you mentioned, the gig economy and so on. Some of those options weren't there in the past. Mm-hmm. So it does seem like the so-called natural rate of unemployment is actually trending lower, and our economy can run at a low inflation rate and still have a low unemployment rate at the same time.
Explain the Phillips curve, because I'm not an economist, so we reach out to economists. So what is the Phillips curve, and how has the Fed traditionally used it to guide its policies?
Right. So an economist named Phillips discovered a correlation between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. And it was a negative correlation most of the time, meaning during recessions, inflation tended to be low and unemployment high. During booms, inflation tended to be high and unemployment low. So that negative correlation, which does exist on certain occasions, led to these models of how the Fed could kind of control the economy. But it turns out that Phillips curve model is not that reliable because there's a number of other factors that come into the equation. And although sometimes it works, at other times it doesn't work. And I think in recent years it's proved to be not a very reliable indicator. And of course, right now we have both low inflation and low unemployment, which theoretically you're not supposed to get with the Phillips curve model.
Well, and certainly I've heard in many scientific circles the axiom of correlation versus causation. And just because something seems to happen, intertwined with something else doesn't mean it's either caused by it or a reaction to it.
Exactly. Yeah, it depends why. So, inflation can rise for many different reasons. You can have what's called a demand shock, where there's a boom in spending pushing up prices. You can have what's called a supply shock, like a drop in oil output or something. Mm-hmm. And depending on what's causing the inflation, the impact on unemployment could be very different.
When we went through the downturn, as you mentioned, 11, 12 years ago in 06, 07, 08, a lot of it seemed to be driven by as just somebody in the radio talking to listeners frequently, going out and looking at businesses, looking at shopping centers. I had often been concerned during the late 90s and early 2000s that we were becoming so much of a service-based economy that all of our jobs seemed to be turning into we'll sell things to each other rather than somebody's making it and then somebody's selling it. And it seemed like all we needed to do was grab onto our wallets just a little tighter this month, and it could start a wave in the negative direction. And then I don't go out to dinner, which means the waitress doesn't get tips, which means she can't pay her rent, which then leads her into you see what I mean, where the mm-hmm. being very fragile. Are we in a place where we're starting to become a little less fragile with the president's policies on manufacturing and some of those things, in your view, Mr. Sumner?
I'm not sure if it's really all that different. I would have a little slightly different view. I think the fragility you talk about actually reflects how well the Federal Reserve is doing its job with monetary policy.
Okay.
Because in my view, these swings don't happen for no reason at all. What's happening is there are certain changes in the economy that occur, and if the Fed reacts appropriately, moving, its interest rates and money supply to the appropriate level, those changes in the economy can be accommodated quite smoothly, and we can continue growing. If they make mistakes in setting policy and don't react to these shocks in the right way, then that can trigger either a recession or, in the other direction, high inflation like we had in earlier decades. So it's a question of, I think, monetary policy keeping the total level of spending growing at a fairly stable rate. I've been advocating what's called a nominal GDP target, which means basically sort of keeping the total dollar spending in the economy growing at roughly 4% a year as the best way to prevent inflation, prevent recessions without having high inflation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with that kind of monetary policy, we can do that. Now, the question about, manufacturing and so on, that's really, I think, a separate question. How much the economy will be manufacturing, how much will be services. Some of the decline in manufacturing is actually due to automation. We're making things with fewer workers.
Mm-hmm.
Some is due to trade. But I think a lot of people underestimate how much is actually due to automation as kind of a long-run trend. So in my view, unfortunately, we're never likely to get the number of manufacturing jobs back that we had before, although we might get output in manufacturing growing strongly. But it'll be more based on robotics, unfortunately, I think.
Well, and I've made it a point to some of my more progressive thinking union supporting friends. I said, well, we all want $40 an hour jobs, and we want 97-cent widgets. And there's a pressure point where the cost of manufacturing something is going to outstrip what we're willing to spend on it. And I guess that's the balancing act professors like yourself and economists have always been watching.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a trade-off, and there's cost, whether it be trade or automation, any kind of dynamic change in the economy. There's going to be winners and losers, but in the long run, hopefully, you have more winners if you have change in a positive, growth-oriented direction.
We're visiting with Professor Scott Sumner, who's written extensively on the Fed, who seems to be at least more gently approaching the last few years of economic challenges in its role. I have a question that I want to ask you in a little while, but I want to, for our listeners' benefit, so much is made the Fed. It is like the McDonald's down the street, but we're not necessarily 100% conversant on how it works. The Fed chair is constantly seemingly at a war of words with the president, but the president installed him there. Explain how the Federal Reserve works as a public but private group that handles our monetary policy.
Yeah, it is kind of a complicated setup. It is a public-private mixture. There's the Board of Governors in Washington, which is a public body, and that's Jay Powell is the chairman of the board. Those members are appointed by the president, confirmed by Congress. Then you have 12 regional Fed banks. They're scattered across the country, and they're in the private sector, although the profits they earn actually goes to the federal government. But so the monetary policy decisions are made by a board that includes both government members and these several of these Fed presidents of private Fed branches. And their basic job is to try to keep the economy relatively stable. They've been given the so-called dual mandate of stable prices and high employment. So they're trying to keep the economy at an even keel. And I use the metaphor of trying to steer an ocean liner between two large rocks or cliffs. If they have too much money, too much expansion in the monetary system, you can get high inflation. If there's too little relative to the demand for money, then you can get recession. So they're trying to set the money supply and interest rates at a level that will be healthy enough for growth, but not too much in terms of triggering high inflation.
Mm-hmm. Is the idea that this is also imperative to the U.S. dollar remaining the reserve currency of the world, and a well-managed Federal Reserve system is something that the global financial markets look at? As long as presidents come, presidents go, but as long as the Federal Reserve is managing our economy well, they'll have faith that the U.S. dollar can be the reserve currency. Is that important?
Yeah, it's important in a number of respects. The dollar, the U.S. is a big economy to begin with, but the dollar is even more important than the size of the U.S. economy because it is so widely used as a reserve currency. And also, maybe even more important, it's increasingly widely used as a way of like borrowing money internationally, or like even countries that don't use the dollar in their own domestic economy, their companies often take out loans in dollar terms. So what's happening to the dollar in, say, the foreign exchange market can have a big effect on especially developing countries, and many countries fix their currency, at least roughly to the dollar in terms of an exchange rate. So the dollar's effect on the global economy is even bigger than you'd think from the size of the U.S. Like Europe as a whole has an economy roughly the size of the United States, but the euro is not nearly as influential because it's not as widely used internationally.
Well, and that's one of the reasons I think the whole world kind of holds its breath when the Fed has its meetings, Professor. You had mentioned Libra earlier, and I know Mark Zuckerberg just last week was on Capitol Hill testifying. Several of our Virginia representatives were in the Financial Services Committee grilling him on this idea. And as it was described to me anyway, you give Facebook money and then they give you credit to use digitally. I said, so they just want to be a Visa card without having to pay Visa users fee. But beyond that, and whether that's actually a cryptocurrency or not, Bitcoin and some of the other cryptocurrencies, are they something the Fed needs to be keeping an eye on? Are they big enough of a factor to weigh in on our monetary policy, Professor?
Not yet, because one of the most important characteristics of money is that things are priced in terms of dollars, to put it simply. So a lot of people think of money in terms of an asset, but what really makes the U.S. dollar special is goods, services, and debts are priced in dollar terms. They're not priced in Bitcoin terms. So even if you buy something using Bitcoin, the thing you're buying is probably priced in dollars, and then they sort of do a conversion.
Okay.
So as long as things remain priced in dollars, then Fed monetary policy will be very, very important, even if people were using cryptocurrencies in the actual transaction. And the reason I say that is because monetary policy basically affects the economy by influencing things like prices of goods, wages, all these things that are priced in dollars, debts, and so on. And so we're not really, I think, even close to where it's having a big effect. Now, if things like Libra became very well established and very widely used, it could be in the future it does become a big factor, especially if things start being priced in terms of their, whatever Libra is calling their currency. So, but we're still a long way away from that. They're essentially what I would call money substitutes, and we've already had money substitutes like credit cards for a long time, and the Fed sort of knows how to address that issue. So it's not a game changer yet, but down the road, especially if we go to a cashless economy, it could become a game changer in the future.
You mentioned changes to the economy, Professor Sumner, and this is sort of an esoteric question that I just want to, when I get around folks with your knowledge, I want to tap in because it's something I feel like we're at. 100 some odd years ago, we were just kind of settling into understanding the new manufacturing age. The Industrial Revolution had a few decades on it, and we were starting to set up labor policy and monetary policy and things like that. And as a society, we were sort of evolving into understanding that it was a different world than it had been, in our parents' or our grandparents' day. Is the digital and technological revolution sort of going through the same thing? You mentioned gig economy jobs and why, perhaps the idea of unemployment being 5% magic number isn't real anymore. Are we still grappling with the kind of economy a technology-based economy is going to be, and what work means, what value of work is, all those factors that weigh into whether we're prosperous or just kind of chugging along?
Yeah, it's not an area I'm a big expert in, but a lot of the stuff I read is people expressing concern about kind of like effects on income inequality and so on. Mm-hmm. So it seems like in the information economy, it's easier for firms to earn enormous profits because the cost of the thing they're producing is often very low. And many of these companies, get large sort of monopoly positions in the sector they're in. Google, Facebook, these mm-hmm. kind of companies, Amazon, and so on. So there is a concern. To me, it's not so much that it's going to hurt the economy, but the question is, will there be enough jobs for lower skilled workers and so on in this world? I don't think we're there yet. A lot of the predictions that automation would create high unemployment have not come true. I mean, we've already talked about how the unemployment rate right now is the lowest in roughly 50 years, I think. Mm-hmm. So those predictions haven't come true, but that seems to be one of the things that people are concerned about at some point in the future. Also the question of antitrust. Do we need to look at antitrust laws in a different way? Again, that's kind of hard to say, but yeah, there are a lot of issues, and they really relate, I think, to the fact that these information-oriented industries tend to be more naturally monopolistic. Like, let me give you an example. In the old economy from when I was young, if a maker of washing machines was doing well and earning a lot of profits, new companies would enter and compete with them, producing other washing machines, right? So mm-hmm. that would keep the profit rate down to a certain level. In the information economy, if somebody like Facebook gets a dominant position, customers want to use that product because other people are using it. So it's hard for a new firm to come in and compete against a very established firm.
And expensive.
Same thing with eBay. Everyone sells on eBay because people are buying on eBay, and people buy on eBay because others are selling. So that's called network effects, and it tends to create a more monopolistic position in some of these new technology industries than you had in the past in the old manufacturing sector.
Right. Yeah, and in the manufacturing sense, you could buy a factory. If a company went out of business, you could get their factory for pennies on the dollar. If a technology firm struggles, the servers may not help, and it's very expensive to come up with another search engine to compete with Google.
Right.
In the hopes
once
that
people are locked into that product, they tend to stick with it. And it's hard for a new entrant to get a toehold.
Well, I appreciate your view on it and the economist's view, and a great piece on the Federal Reserve and how it may be finally grasping what it's supposed to be doing, and that's good news for a lot of us. But Professor Sumner, thank you very much for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Thank you for inviting me.
Coming up next, we're going to jump over to the Cato Institute. Doug Bandow has written a piece on Syria and how it's not America's war, and how the administration seems to grasp what Congress doesn't. Next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.